Hello, and thanks so much for joining the Invisible Americans podcast with Jeff Madrick and Carol Jenkins. We address the travesty of child poverty here.
There are nearly 13 million children living in serious material deprivation in America, and we don't see them. They are our invisible Americans, and we plan to change that.
A couple of words about us. The podcast is based on Jeff's book, Invisible Americans, The Tragic Cost of Child Poverty. He's an economics writer, author of 7, and co-author of another 4 books on the American economy.
And Carol is an Emmy-winning journalist, activist, and author, most recently president of the ERA Coalition, working to amend the Constitution to include women.
And we are longtime colleagues and friends. Our country is in a declared kids' mental health state of emergency. One measure is the rise in suicides by our children, some as young as 5 years old. Suicides are now the second most frequent cause of death of young people 10 to 24. It's the leading cause of death in Asian children. Black children under 13 are twice as likely to die of suicide as their white counterparts. A quarter of LGBTQ students attempted suicide in a year. And 1 in 10 of New York City's 300,000 students were reported to have attempted suicide. To get some clarity on this problem and the solutions, Jeff and I talked with Jonnel Doris, CEO of START New York, a 55-year-old Brooklyn-based mental health organization working in many of our inner-city communities. Most of their thousands of clients are adults, but they do have a groundbreaking teen program that helps children 12 to 17. START New York thinks the problems of our kids are so urgent that they probably need to start in first grade. Thank you so much, Jonnel, for being with us today and for the extraordinary work that you are doing. If you could tell us about START. I know that you are relatively new to the organization, which has been around for over, 50 years?
Thank you so much, Carol. It's always good to be with you. START's been around for 55 years. I've been the CEO here for the last 2 years. And the organization, specializes in addiction, mental health, and particularly something that's unique for an organization like ourselves, biomedical and behavioral health research. We've had a long research history and also providing specialty care, HIV, Hep C, and so forth.
And apparently over 50,000 clients the organization has seen, and you're based in Brooklyn.
Yeah, we're based in Brooklyn. Our headquarters, Waverly and Fulton Street, is where we had our first clinic, which is still going today. We're also in Bushwick, East New York, Harlem, East Harlem, Washington Heights. So I think it's probably closer to over 65,000 unique individuals we've serviced with this specialty care over the years. Where we sort of do the multiplier effect because, one individual is 4 others that you really impact when you think about the work we're doing. So, it's hundreds of thousands of people across the city for the last 55 years. We've been impacting for the good.
So tell us a little bit about how it works. What do you do for them? You must have a lot of professionals with you.
I always start with who certifies you, kind of tells the tale of what you do and who works for you. And so when you think about the Department of Health, the Department of Mental Health at the state level, DOHMH at the city level, OASAS that deals with the addiction services on the state level. So those are the folks who certify us, and of course, SAMHSA on the federal level. I always joke with folks, I've got 32 regulators at some point or shape or form. So we're a healthcare organization. We're a mini hospital system, if that makes it easier for folks, and a clinical system, and where we employ primarily nurses, doctors, mental health specialists, psychiatrists, and in our non-clinical programs, our researchers, our PhD researchers and the like, and also our vocational programming that really supports a comprehensive care model that we provide here.
We're very interested in your teen program, what you do with kids from 12 to 17. Tell us about that.
Our Teen Start program is a comprehensive mental health service program for young people 12 to 17. And so many of whom have experienced serious social isolation, mental health challenges, and behavioral challenges alike. And some of the things that we do for them work with them is around mental health care as a trauma-informed individual, but also family and group therapy, right? Crisis intervention, we do de-escalation. We also provide very uniquely comprehensive psychiatric evaluations with our teen psychiatrists or child psychiatrists that we have on staff here at START. And one thing that you're going to hear, I hope, sort of throughout our conversation is the role we think we ought to play in the sort of grander scheme of things to raise awareness and destigmatize people and young people who are actually seeking support.
Do you do something like a percentage of people who have recovered who are now you can call well, or is that up to the certification people?
This is a very interesting question as you know, how do you determine where individuals are on their progress, right? And the industry moved to a sort of harm reduction model and a patient-centric model, which the patient determines, and have the agency to determine, along with their clinical providers, what they determine to be success. And our role is to help support that and help them to get to where they need to be. So that varies from individual to individual. It could be some are seeking sobriety, others are seeking better management of maybe their addiction. But when it comes to mental health, that's a journey. Wanting to make sure the patient, those who we are working with, our participants have the ability to achieve their healthcare goals. And that's how we sort of want to frame that. We've had great success, working with young people. A significant number of our young people are with us over 2 years. And if you think about what that means that they're getting care that they needed, right? And so if you think about the median amount of years they're with us, it's about close to 2.9 years. And I think that's very important to say that they're coping, they're getting the support, they're getting the help, and they're growing. And they want to stay with the program to continue their efforts. And so we sort of measure success in that way.
I'm pretty impressed by that. So they come out, what is it, 2.9 years on average, knowing that they've succeeded, that they're getting what they want?
We have clinical treatment goals for each person in our program. And at the end of the day, it's, again, between them and the mental health provider to give them the supports that they need. So electing to, if you're with us as a young person for 2.9 years is a significant number of time, working with our clinicians to help support that young person. And so they're certainly walking out the door when that ever happens with a better sense of, who they are and achieving their clinical goals.
Talk to us about the number. Is it 1 in 10 kids in the New York City high school systems who have actually attempted suicide? That's not just having thought about it, but actually attempted to do it. What's going on there?
Yeah, this is shocking, as you can imagine. Myself being a parent and a community leader and working with young people for most of my life, it is very, very troubling. And so that is a statistic that came from the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene in the city. And I think this is 2021 data. They haven't updated that portion, but thinking about all the complexities post-pandemic might be even worse now. But certainly that's high school students. 1 in 10 is 36,000 or something like that students who actually attempted suicide. And so you're right, that's disturbing number. Folks, I think that there's a multiplicity of reasons why, or things that we can put our kind of thumb on. But you have to look at it sort of in a broader context and broader challenges that we're seeing across our society, right? So first of all, we know that the sort of worry as a measure, right? Worry among young people is at an all-time high. General worry, family worry, self-worry, worry about their future, 84% on a daily basis. Thinking about this, and for those who also consume, by the way, social media, which is a huge piece to this, we're seeing the correlations there. One that I know you all are very, very understanding of and really trying to solve for is poverty. We see the connections and correlations there. Also, the environment the young person is in, their housing situation, their food situation, all these social determinants of health are kind of driving what we believe the connection to mental health challenges. And then lastly, I say, in my view, at least as a society, is what happened in the pandemic and really assessing the pandemic loss of life that young people had to face. 8,600 young people lost at least one parent during the pandemic. Think about that impact that has on our young people. Also, when you think about not only loss of life, but the social isolation that we're still recovering from. All these factors, social media, social determinants of health, poverty, the trauma that students are faced with post-pandemic, loss of life, social isolation they're seeking to come out of, the impact of that. We're seeing that reflected in some of these numbers.
How about hunger, pure and simple?
We link hunger to food insecurity. These are very complex, integrated challenges that our society really needs to figure out how we're going to solve. If we don't get a grip on this, look, young people are dying. Our numbers are going up when it comes to mental health challenges. And, a lot of this, again, is linked back to environments that create stress, that create worry, that impact young people at all levels of the spectrum.
And I noticed that the figures for kids who are having to go through lockdowns for gun safety for those trials that they go through, that anxiety and depression are markedly up for that. And as we know, guns are the number one killer of our kids in this country.
Again, very sobering, right? These are very sobering statistics and analyses that are being done that makes our work and the work that we do so much more important, but also, speaks to, I think, the universal response that needs to happen, the universal engagement that needs to happen on a broad scale, more conversations like these, more awareness building across our city and our nation. The challenges of poverty, poverty is a structural issue. And it's impacting communities across the board, wealth of neighborhoods you live in, the environment, the social factors, gun violence. We see folks from the leadership turning a blind eye to the challenges that are there. But that does not erase in that particular trigger or challenge that our young people are experiencing.
What about substance abuse for this group of kids from 12 to 17? Do you find that is a real issue, either alcohol or fentanyl or pot? Is that up?
I wouldn't say it's a driver. We are monitoring that very closely. I mean, we do have some interaction with substances, but that's not the primary, driver, along with all the supports that we're giving for young people. But it is a factor, but it's really not a primary factor.
So, Jonnel, if you could talk with us about solutions. You say that we need a national conversation about this. How do we fix this?
We need to make sure that whatever we're trying to do, it has to address this in a holistic perspective. So we're thinking about, policy changes or increase in investment in this work is needed. So those two things are huge policy shifts on how the city is approaching this. And I think given what we know as a data format, there's four really big areas we've got to work on. Number one, housing. We need a housing first model. Right. Housing is at the center of a lot of the challenges that we're facing and seeing. It has to be accessible, affordable housing program. The second one is around, again, these social determinants of health around food When you think about increasing fresh food and what that means, accessibility to food. The third, economics, got to really work in communities to build up early childhood education, how these institutes manage to serve their budget, job training for parents, and the impact of poverty on the parents ultimately impact child poverty. Then lastly, access to care. A survey was just put out again by the department, DOHMH, the Teen Mental Health Survey 2023, and 55% of the responses said, well, we thought we can handle it. Another 53% of the responses said they did not share with their family what they were going through, that they needed mental health support. So there's a stigma issue that we've got to address, right? And so when you talk about access to care, we've got to talk about making sure care is available, making sure care is accessible for young people. We have to deal with the stigma issues. And then lastly, because again, we're coming back to sort of the poverty discussion, 14% say, hey, I didn't think I can afford this. These solutions, we have to qualify them. They have to be flexible. They must be targeted, and it has to be sustainable. We can't just do, one-offs. Everybody's different. Communities are different. We need to make sure that we are doing it. It's got to be targeted to specific groups of young people. We know with social media, young girls, we're having additional challenges there. We need to figure out some real serious investment there that's targeted to that population. We got to be able to do this for the long term. As we mentioned, young people in our program are there 2.9 years. This is a long-term investment in our community, in our city.
And you have said that you think that you need to start earlier than 12. How early do you think that we need to begin to grapple with these mental health issues?
It's impacting them from birth, right? We had an adopt a school program where we worked with an elementary school to begin to have the conversation about, what is it that is needed in that community of young people, of students, and the challenges that they have. So you have to move upstream. You have to start the conversation early, but certainly moving upstream to really get to our young people a lot faster, a lot quicker. A school-based model is also what we believe is important. And from a school-based model, we also mean a community-based model, right? Because the schools are the center of the community, our faith communities, the people in that particular community all working together to really address this head on.
Well, I find this pretty fascinating. Good luck with all of that. And of course, you didn't talk about it too much, but you also have to find sources of funding for these kids. So we'll be speaking to you again if that's okay.
Well, I look forward to the conversation, and I appreciate you all, having me on.
Thank you so much for the tremendous work that you're doing. We look forward to you being a part of the big solutions across the country.
It also starts with getting the word out. So thank you all for the part that you're playing in this.
Again, thank you.
Thanks, Jonnel.
Thank you.
Jeff and I had a great conversation with Bahamian writer Soraya Chemaly, author of The Resilience Myth, New Thinking on Grit, Strength, and Growth After Trauma. The author of the previous book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, is asking us in this new book, for our children's sake, to reconsider the idea we've been raised on that resilience is an individual effort, and replace that with community, reliance on each other. She gives as an example the celebrated British explorer Ernest Shackleton, who took a team to Antarctica from 1914 to 1917 against tremendous odds. But at what cost? Thank you so much for being with us today. I have enjoyed tremendously your book. And as I said to you at some point, listening to you read it was actually wonderful.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice of you.
I recommend the audio version as well as the print version. And you're busting a myth here that most of us have bought into and lived our lives by.
Yes.
If you could tell us, it's an interesting story about how you came to write this particular book.
A couple of things. One is my last book was about anger and gender. And ultimately, at the end, it was about why we don't care what makes women mad. we don't care as a society, right? As a power dynamic. And so then I wanted to write a book about care ethics and why it's so hard for us as a culture to embrace them. And then COVID happened, and then my uncle died, and then my father died, and there was a hurricane. And it was just a very compressed period of very sad things happening and lots of emotions and this notion of care. And at that point, because it was all of those things that had really acute physical impacts on everyone, it was really just striking to me how much our resilience ideas are disembodied, mind-based, disconnected from material reality and need and resources and all of those things. So I went back to my editor, who really wanted me to write a book about trauma, which I was not interested in writing. And I said, well, I think this all comes together in this notion of resilience and how we frame it and what's problematic about it and what alternatives look like. And that's how I ended up here with you today.
Right. It's terrific. But we're talking about the always the bootstraps, Hey, pull yourself together. You can do this.
On your own, you can do it.
And you find that not to be the case.
I sort of systematically go through these myths. One is definitely hyper-individualism. And it's not just hyper-individualism, but a particular kind of masculine individualism that we frame in terms of a nebulous idea of strength, autonomy, mental toughness, the inverse of which is physical frailty, I will add. And then from there, other kind of mind-based ideas and traits and attributes like grit and optimism and positive thinking. And I try and just show the ways in which those ideas as ideologies really depend on and encourage us to disconnect our minds from our bodies, ourselves from other people, humanity from nature, in line with all the other kind of social and political divisions we're all fighting to end. So it's this quality of disconnection that defines that resilience.
Exactly. I love the story you told about the great heroic adventurer.
Oh, Shackleton. Yes.
Who is a hero, except that you then write about what else he did not do.
I don't know how many people are familiar with Shackleton, and it has recently come to my attention that several Bahamian writers and artists, including me, are writing about and kind of obsessed with ice and the poles, which is very funny. But yeah, he was this famed explorer who did successfully lead his entire crew out of a 2-year debacle on the ice. And if you say it that way, it sounds great. Terrific leader, determined, never gave up, gritty, strong, the kind of perfect image of powerful white masculinity at the time. And that all sounds great until you think, well, how'd they get there to begin with? Multiple experts said, don't go. He had to manipulate a lot of people, including his wife, to get a lot of money. He was a media grandstander. He was optimistic to the point of delusional. All of these things that we don't talk about. And the other thing we don't talk about is the collective resilience that developed among this group of people as the result of being able to care for each other, to navigate emotional stresses, to trust. They had social trust. They had a feeling of belonging. They had a feeling of purpose. And all of that gets swamped out in the glorification of his leadership.
What were his years?
Shackleton left on the Endurance just as World War I was starting, and they never made it to the pole. They traveled, got shipwrecked on the ice, created a floating island of deprivation and despair. Thank God there was no cannibalization at that point. But he eventually trekked an amazing journey by any description through hurricane force winds, got to an island, walked across the mountains on the island, and got to a whaling station, and then convinced Brazil to give him a ship. And then he went and rescued his crew.
Wow, it's quite a story.
It is a story, I have to say.
It is a story, but my sympathy was all with his wife.
Yeah, well, yes. And also, people on his crew, they lost digits and they were sick and they ended up dying in the long term. And he just couldn't take no. And he ended up dying there because he had heart failure of some sort that he was warned about. And his wife said, please don't go. And his doctor said, you can't go. And he went and he left his wife and children impoverished. And it was just this kind of narcissistic drive to have that glory, which he got regardless of the fact that he failed to achieve the actual goal that he set out to achieve.
So that's exactly what we're talking about, that the sort of admiration for that kind of persistence, never taking a good look at the devastation all around him, most of us, while we try to persevere delusionally as one might. And this happens very early. This is the way we were trained. Well, we all were trained as children. Hopefully your influence will mean that children being taught and raised now can give up some of this, wild, I can do it on my own and I have to be resilient.
I will say one thing connected to this about Shackleton. When you actually looked at Shackleton's leadership qualities, they were what we now think of as very feminine leadership qualities. He had high emotional competence. He understood the personalities of his crew. He nurtured them and organized them in ways that would enhance their ability to cooperate instead of undermine it. And the list of characteristics that are related to those things don't get foregrounded, but they are, in fact, the characteristics that today people gravitate towards in crises when they want women leaders. They're really similar. They're much more collectivist in their kind of description. And so I think that, to your point, young children very often, because of these resilience agendas in schools, can still really feel that the burden of adapting is theirs to bear alone as individuals, that it's a trait that they have to develop internally, a quality of mind, which I think makes it much more socially acceptable to deprive them of the things they really need to be well and not just survive, but to thrive in those environments.
Well, yeah, let's get back to children, because that's...
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain a little further what they are missing now, what they're deprived of now?
At the bare minimum, we have tens of thousands of children who need food and they have to get it from schools. They actually just need the basic materials of life: food, shelter, clothing, like that. Those levels of poverty are endemic in childhood in America. And yet we have policymakers who are stopping school meals. They're actually closing off those resources. And so one of the things I think that really came out in the research I did is that in under-resourced communities, not only is there that level of sort of basic sustenance deprivation, but entire communities are suffering. And schools then take on the role, if they are thinking in more cohesive ways, they take on the role of helping the community. They become community centers. They provide counseling for grandparents and for parents. They have job fairs. They understand that the well-being of the child, the resilience of the child, is directly related to their nurture and to the nurturing of their environments. And that includes their physical environments, right? And so there are really these two competing models, one of which I think of as one of disconnection and deprivation and isolation, that is hyper invested in teaching kids how to just power through hardship on their own. And another that says, we're not going to maybe focus so much at this stage on getting straight A's. We're going to make sure that you feel safe, that you have adults you trust, that you have enough food to think properly. And those are two competing things, I think, and they both talk about resilience, but they talk about resilience in different ways.
That's pretty darn interesting.
Yeah. Jeff has written in his book and has always said that he cannot understand how somebody could say, no, I'm not giving you school lunches,
I know. It's just criminal.
What is the mentality that brings you to that point?
It's really craven. It's really enraging to think about that, and the other thing that was really striking to me was the tessellation of the idea of resilience so that it became about good grades, because kids can get good grades and yet really not ultimately be resilient. They get good grades because they want to reduce stress at home, because they want to get accolades that it makes them safe in some way. There are lots of ways in which a kid can perform that way and yet not feel cared for, nurtured, loved, secure, connected to people, and get straight A's. And one of the critiques I have is that we really should step away from that idea that academic performance somehow equals resilience, because in the end, those kids could be really harmed by that metric instead of helped by that metric.
Well, that's pretty original thinking. I have to congratulate you. I don't hear too much original thinking.
Well, thank you.
So let's talk about how we then get away from the you can do it, you're all on your own. Usually what's happening these days that if somebody says we're going to give you free lunch, we're going to make sure, that you have a place to live, or you're accused of being a communist or worse, as opposed to being a thoughtful, caring person. How do we change this gestalt for a large part of our country?
It's interesting because I think a couple of things. One is it reflects an ideal of a relationship to the state. In our founding statehood ideals, the people who created our system of governance wanted the government out of their business, out of their lives, let them be free, as minimal as possible, really. And that kind of presupposed a couple of things: able-bodied man, capable of self-sufficiency, all of which are part of the ideology of resilience that I write about, right? Being able-bodied, being a man, being self-sufficient, and not needing. And there's a second model of governance that's more based on human vulnerability, interdependence, and mutual care. So the first is I'm self-sufficient. I don't need anything from anybody. I can take care of myself. I'm strong. I'm independent. And the second one is that can all be true, but at some point, all of us are dependent physically. We are all, in the terminology of the first model, disabled in some way, either by infancy or illness or old age. Whatever it may be, we rely on other people. And none of us is actually at all self-sufficient. A lot of the self-sufficiency that gets touted in terms of independent working men, for example, comes from the fact that there's unrecognized, unpaid work being done at home to take care of children, take care of houses, take care of doctors, take care of friends, take care of parents.
And so how do you go about making the change?
Honestly, I think the change is going. I thought a lot during the course of the past year about the way young kids have been categorized as not very resilient, oversensitive, needing safe spaces, et cetera, et cetera. And then what happened with student protests on campuses, for anti-war protests, both for Israel, for Palestinians, whichever protests you're talking about. And what was notable to me about so many of those protests was that the kids were super resilient because they were persevering despite all kinds of challenges. And they were also creating these instant communities on the ground that were collective mutual care communities. They respected diversity and pluralism within their communities. They respected people's religious orientations. They had food. They were making camps that kind of looked like Dakota pipeline camps. They were trying to embody values that they were defending. I don't think really these kids get enough credit for the amount of trauma they've lived through, basically since 9/11. Their childhood took place from about 2000 to now. And they're adapting in the best ways they can. They're not going to adapt in the ways older generations did, because they face a completely different set of challenges. And they also face a different temporal order. Like their lives are framed by technological and social acceleration. And so we can't expect these comparisons to hold in any meaningful way.
We, of course, here talk about childhood poverty, endlessly, policy changes, in this looking for ways to make everybody understand how, as we would think, amoral, not to feed, So talk to us just a little bit about what you see as the solution for that.
I don't think you can separate childhood poverty from wage and wealth gaps that affect women and women of color most profoundly, because we don't have a duty of care, ethic of care in our governance. The burden of care falls on women still. And because women don't have as much wealth and don't have workplace systems calibrated to their particular roles and needs, they just face greater and greater impoverishment as our general income inequality deepens. And as long as that's the case, childhood poverty will be sustained and exacerbated. I mean, I think if, the first step in addressing childhood poverty is closing those gaps and reorganizing our workplace norms to appreciate the fact that everyone has to be providing care. Men have to do it. Women have to do it. Queer communities do it. Everyone should be valuing that care, and honestly would benefit from participation in that care, because we already know we have a big gender divide in Gen Z, but we also know we have the biggest divide ever between generations. There's very little interaction between generations, and everybody suffers from that. The youngest people suffer from it. The oldest people suffer from it. They both have the greatest rates of loneliness. And the people in between suffer from it because they're just sandwiched with trying to meet the needs in both directions.
So it's making sure that women are paid equally.
I would say that's a first step, making sure that institutions, honestly, in the United States, we're not even at the bare minimum for peer countries, right? Like, we are really the absolute worst. So we're not even talking about being the best. We're just talking about meeting the floor, right? And we don't do that.
Are you optimistic? I'm sure everybody asks every interview about the resolution of resilience, dependency, and inequality.
I just was talking about this yesterday, and I know you know what this is like. When you're so immersed in something, you lose sight of what it means not to be immersed in the thing. I've been really writing a lot about Gen Z because they are the generation that will come into power in the next 30 years. And their polarization is more extreme than any other generations in every way, their gender polarization. And that's true overall, and it's also true within every demographic cohort. It's most extreme between white men and white women, which I take actually as a really good sign, because it means that a large block of young white women are frankly willing to betray white supremacy in favor of democracy. But young white men are not doing that. And so because of their anxieties or aggrievement or whatever defensiveness they're feeling, and they describe it as defensiveness, those feelings make them much more susceptible, I think, to anti-democratic, fascist, strongmen movements. And that's true here, and it's true around the world. But we have a whole generation that's it's kind of balancing on this edge where one large portion, mainly men, is holding on to the past and that system of governance that we just described. And a larger politically active group of women is saying, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're angry. We're super disappointed. We cannot trust you. They literally don't trust men because they've grew up in the last 10 years of watching a lot of bad things happen. So they're just moving forward. And that gives me hope, actually.
I'm learning a lot here.
Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your thoughts. You've got a high compliment. If Jeff thinks you have original thinking, that's something.
Good luck with your mission, and I'll try to support it. I didn't even know there was an anti-resilient program around.
Well, I'm not anti-resilience. I'm just anti a particular ideology of resilience. I think resilience is great.
Thanks so much. Mark Bittman is the celebrity food writer, formerly of the New York Times, author of more than 30 books, including Animal Vegetable Junk, The History of Food from Sustainable to Suicidal. So you can tell he's serious about food. Now he is serious about the right to food and is working on the idea of nonprofit restaurants where people pay sliding tabs according to their ability. Jeff and I got some details on his plan called the Community Kitchen and says this is his most important project yet. Mark, we are absolutely intrigued by your concept of the community restaurant, and it's an exciting possibility. Tell us, how you came to this. It really seems to be one of the key solutions.
There's sort of a big picture and a little picture here. And the big picture is the notion of food as utility, which is not far from my idea originally. But the notion that food, like healthcare, like housing, like security, should be a right that everyone has is not a new concept. It's a very, very radical concept, especially in the United States, which so strongly and in many ways idiotically believes it's kind of every person for him or herself. It's not new, and people have been talking about it in the States and elsewhere for centuries and certainly for decades. There are a few recent examples and also ancient examples of people feeding one another, not as a sense of charity, which is a kind of a different concept, but as a sense of community. So it's not you're poor, I'm not, therefore I'm such a great person, I'm going to help take care of you. It's more like we're in this together. We all deserve certain rights. Food is among them. And, you saw that in Brazil. The best example was in Brazil in the 90s, where there were community kitchens. They were called popular restaurants, restaurantes populares, where everybody could eat state-supported, good state-supported food, organic food for that matter, at a reasonable price. The school lunch program is sort of an example of this, or it's at least a point in the right direction. There's a sort of originally Hindu sect, but now independent religion known as Sikhism. Many people have heard of the Sikhs. And the Sikhs provide free food for everyone at all of their temples. And it's an amazing site, even if, there's one within 10 miles of me. It's tiny and it's not hugely significant, but it's still an amazing site. But the ones in India feed thousands and thousands of people a day. It's quite remarkable. And then you have even a history of community restaurants in Great Britain, which were called British restaurants. And they started in the World War I as community restaurants to make sure that everybody could get fed, and they were government supported, and they continued in the interwar period. They continued through World War II and even up until the 70s. And that legacy exists in England. So all I'm saying is the idea of there being a place in the neighborhood where people could go eat good food at reasonable prices is not a novel one. The idea of what I'm talking about, which we're calling community kitchen, is pretty novel in the United States and has not been and will not be easy to launch because it's quite ambitious, really.
Well, you're looking to start your first physical plant of the community kitchen and raising funds for that. How is that going? How is the pitch for that? And do you find funders who eager to join you?
There's enthusiasm. No one thinks it's a terrible idea, or no one says to me that it's a terrible idea. We have successfully raised relatively small amounts of money, so hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm not saying that's not significant, but we need millions. We are now a team of 5. For 2 or 3 years, it was me and whoever I had working with me, sometimes volunteers, sometimes students, sometimes minimally paid intern types. But now we are a team of 5 real professionals, people with expertise in working in community food organizations, people with expertise in founding nonprofits, people with expertise in running nonprofits, food nonprofits, people with business expertise. So whereas up until 6 months ago, it was mostly me doing what I could, and my skills are highly limited. In fact, my biggest so-called skill may be my visibility. But now we have a real team, and we are doing long-term planning, I believe a very credible spreadsheet, guidelines for how we hire, how we ally with people, how we identify sites, how we work with others. let me just back up a second. There are four sort of pillars of community kitchen, and three of them are pretty straightforward. The first is sourcing great food and treating farmers right. Well, people are doing that. We know how to do that. The second is paying workers as the professionals they are. And that too is happening increasingly, especially since COVID. Even fast food chains have doubled what they're paying workers in the last 5 years. The third is cooking great, nutritious food. Well, we know how to do that. But the fourth is a sliding scale. That is to say, everybody pays not what they want, not some arbitrary number, but according to their income. So people of low income pay one price, people of moderate income pay another, and people of high income pay a third, and perhaps there's even a super level. Figuring out that fourth thing, which has really not been done and not been done successfully, is really challenging. So we are thinking now is we are going to continue to raise relatively small amounts of money to keep ourselves afloat for the next 6 months or maybe even a year, and try to do back up again and do a pop-up where we see what the problems are. We don't anticipate a problem in sourcing, but maybe we're not seeing everything. Same with labor, same with cooking and serving. We don't know enough about how the sliding scale will work. Can we attract enough wealthy people who are willing to pay literally 20 times as much as people who have small amounts of money pay for the same meal? Or is that just too challenging a concept? We need to find out what the right balance is between people who pay less and people who pay more, and how many of each we can attract. Because as you can imagine, if we have an overwhelming number of people paying as little as possible, we need more income from external sources in order to survive. If we have an overwhelming number of people who are paying top dollar, we're not fulfilling our mission of feeding people who ordinarily don't get to eat at farm-to-table restaurants. So there's a middle ground where we'd like to land, but we don't know what that might look like. We don't know what's possible. So a pop-up will not answer every question, but it'll give us some indications that we can't do without a little experimentation. We need empirical evidence at this point.
Do you have any empirical evidence now?
Most empirical evidence we have now is discouraging, because people who have tried to do, and they're mostly called pay what you can or pay what you want restaurants, most of them, A, have not been ambitious in the way that we're planning to be ambitious, but B, have failed. We hope to learn from that and obviously not fail. So there's not a roadmap for this. There really isn't. And we don't want to open until we have some confidence of success.
Where, Mark, would you start? What do you see as the perfect place for the pop-up, for the first community kitchen?
The pop-up will happen in New York. We're all New Yorkers, and it just doesn't make sense to do it elsewhere. The first restaurant could be anywhere, because there is a scenario in which, if you talk to entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, they will all say the business you wind up with is not the business you thought of when you first started. Everyone says that. So there is a scenario in which we wind up helping other people open nonprofit restaurants that serve their communities, and we don't actually do that. I've talked to people in Detroit, in New Hampshire, in Nebraska, and California who are all experimenting with similar ideas, and it may just be that we're the team that can garner enough resources to help others get over the top. Or, the plan is to open a restaurant to start to work on a restaurant that we're running within a year. And that, again, it's likely to be in the New York area, but we're not committed to that because it's too early to say that for sure.
It's quite a challenge. We congratulate you on pursuing this challenge, but there are a heck of a lot of unknowns, as you're making very clear to us. What happens if it all fails?
Then the next person who tries to do it has more information than we did. That's the most common positive reaction to the idea of community kitchen is, this is a great idea. This is something that's bound to happen. I believe that. I don't believe that our destiny, that my destiny is to be the person who makes this happen. I believe that we are working on it right now and we want to make it happen. If we fail, I think that just proves that we didn't do it well enough, but someone will. So that's what happens if we fail.
Thanks so much, Mark, for being with us today.
Thank you, and congratulations on all your work.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Invisible Americans podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. But we urge you to visit our website for transcripts, show notes, research, and additional information about our guests and their work. That's www.theinvisibleamericans.com. Please follow us on social media and our new YouTube channel. And our blog posts are up on Medium as well as our website. That's www.theinvisibleamericans.com. Jeff and I will see you the next time.